In early 2019, climate change led to the first bankruptcy of a major actor in the energy sector, the American company Pacific Gas Electric. An investigation is underway, and the company, which is accused of causing the massive wildfires that hit the state in November 2018, killing 86 people and destroying 14,000 homes, estimates that the compensation claimed is $30 billion. This first-of-its-kind case illustrates the imminent danger that climate poses to businesses. While many still consider it a remote risk, climate risks, whether physical or transitional, can affect the real economy and thus the financial equilibrium of a company. In this video, we will see how to assess the interactions between climate risks and the components of a company's credit risk analysis. How can physical climate risks be reflected in the financial analysis of companies? And similarly, how can transition risks materialize in their financial analysis? Let's begin by recalling some of the fundamentals of company analysis. This analysis makes it possible to assess its financial soundness and consists of 1. Analyzing its profitability in order to identify the main levers of value creation and the main costs associated with the production process. 2. Identifying the different players in the value chain, suppliers, customers, and the company's position in relation to its stakeholders. 3. Analyzing the cash flow statement in order to have an overview of the constitution of its cash level and the way it is generated. And finally, 4. Analyzing the company's ability to invest and to repay its financial commitments. In particular, a company may be exposed to exogenous shocks, such as climatic risks, which may have an impact on its financial strength. As we will see later, these risks can have an impact at 3 levels: on its production and profitability, on its assets and investment needs, and ultimately on the value of the company. Physical risks are extreme climatic events, heat waves, cyclones, storms, or more gradual consequences of climate change, changes in precipitation patterns, gradual increase in temperature, rising sea levels. They can impact the operation of a company at several levels. Let's start by looking at production. The following questions can be asked. Is the company's production process likely to be subject to physical risk? What are the key assets of the company that may be impacted? And to identify these assets, it is important to be able to geolocate them, as physical risks are often geolocated. The question of the location of assets, while central, does not provide a sufficient framework for reading the situation. The impact of a local climatic phenomenon can be felt more widely in the surrounding economic fabric through phenomena of contagion and dependence between economic players, forming chains that are sometimes difficult to untangle. For example, could suppliers or the supply chain be impacted? What about customers? For example, in agriculture, a drought or a change in temperature and rainfall can lead to a drop in agricultural yields, and extreme weather conditions can lead to a drop in labor productivity. This can lead to an increase in commodity prices and impact the entire downstream agri-food value chain if the company cannot pass on the price increase to its end customers. Another example, in the hydropower sector, the hydrometric regime, partly determined by precipitation, has an impact on the ability of a power plant to produce sufficient electricity, resulting in lower revenues for the company. High variability in precipitation can also lead to a more general need to manage water storage, to facilitate the smoothing of power generation, and avoid flooding of the dam, or to allow water recovery for agriculture in times of drought. Let's now turn our attention to the capacity to generate cash flow. At this level, the impacts are of several kinds. In particular, we can identify a drop in production, which leads to a drop in the company's operating cash flow, The risk can also be imported through the supplier-customer contagion chains, negatively impacting the company's working capital requirements. Suppliers who have lost confidence following the materialization of a risk demand to be paid more quickly. Or customers affected by a physical hazard are unable to repay their debts or pay for a service already provided. The impact may also be reflected in a change in the prices of the assets that the company holds. Damage caused by physical climate hazards to a company's infrastructure, electrical installations, equipment, buildings, roads, may generate additional investment needs, depreciation of asset values, interruption of production. These risks materialize in the form of a deterioration in the company's ability to generate cash flow and repay its debt, a downgrading of its credit rating, and an increase in its financing costs, or even a liquidity crisis. A company may, for example, insure its key assets. It should be noted, however, that some risks may become uninsurable, or insurance premiums may become unaffordable. The company can also diversify its suppliers and customers, or in the case of an electricity company, its sources of energy production. There is also the question of the impact on its investment plan, maintenance or new investments to be made to adapt or repair. For example, port infrastructures may have to take into account the rise in sea level and increase their investments to avoid the risk of traffic interruption and therefore a drop in income or the risk of damage to existing infrastructures. More generally, one might ask what impact these risks have on the company's ability to repay its financial commitments. Does the company have tools implemented to detect these risks? What kind of climate data projections does it use to anticipate the impacts of climate change? And finally, does the company have a sufficiently robust financial base to recover from the materialization of a climate risk? Finally, climate risk can also lead to a deterioration in the immediate profitability of the company, which also translates into a drop in operating cash flows. In the case of hydroelectric power, for example, in the event of persistent drought, the energy produced decreases or becomes scarcer or more expensive if the operator can mobilize alternative energy sources. In Colombia, Medellin's electricity operator, EPM, saw its main construction asset affected by an extreme weather event. The Ituango Dam suffered heavy rains in spring 2018, which led to landslides. This, coupled with design errors, clogged the dam, threatening it to collapse. This had a significant impact on the construction and commissioning schedule. The start of production was postponed to 2022, even though Fitch expected more than 30% of EPM's energy production to come from Ituango in 2019 and more than 45% in 2020. Fitch estimated that this event would result in an EBITDA loss of 21% in 2019 compared to the base case financial projections, and the company was downgraded by the rating agencies in the same year. The impact on revenues and cash flows is illustrated by the following examples, which also show how the situation is managed in different countries. In Kenya, the state-owned power generation operator, which relies on hydropower as one of its main sources of generation, regularly faces periods of drought. For example, in 2017, a severe drought affected reservoir water levels and resulted in a 12% drop in dispatched hydropower compared to 2016, and a decrease in electricity revenues of about 5%. Faced with these climatic risks, the operator is pursuing a strategy of diversifying its sources of energy production, a significant part of which is also geothermal. It is also turning to solar and wind power. In countries with a more mature energy market, the adjustment is made by increasing the cost of the kilowatt-hour rather than by limiting the volume. In Colombia, where hydroelectricity represents 70% of the country's energy mix, the climatic risk is reflected in potentially longer or more frequent drought periods, increased recurrence of the El Niño phenomenon. In 2015, following an episode of severe drought, the main electricity operator, seeing the level of its dams fall, had to buy energy produced by thermal power plants on the spot market at very high prices in order to honor the long-term sales contracts it had concluded. Its EBITDA margin fell to 30% in 2015-2016, down from the usual 50%. In Namibia, the operator's cost price also increases drastically when the water level in its only dam is insufficient, as it must turn to imports on the spot market. Facing these risks, operators can equip themselves with anticipation and decision-making tools, satellite images, dam measurement instruments, weather forecasting, and energy modeling. The level of sophistication and maturity of the company in this field is crucial, but not always sufficient. Also, to limit the impact of rising energy prices, there are various mechanisms. In Namibia, for example, a levy on the electricity tariff feeds into a reserve account, which can be used to subsidize the increase in the price per kilowatt-hour to consumers in times of drought. Transition risks can be of several kinds. They can be induced by policies, such as the introduction of a carbon tax or an increase in its price, the cessation of subsidies for emissive products, or the strengthening of standards and regulations. They may also be induced by technological innovations that may change the company's position in its market, or by changes in consumer behavior that, following an increase in ecological awareness, may prefer certain products to others. On the one hand, they can impact production processes and the associated costs linked to the introduction or increase of a carbon tax, if the business model is based on emissive inputs, or if it is highly energy-intensive from fossil sources. This impact will be felt to a greater or lesser extent depending on the ability of the company to pass on the increased costs to its end customers. Similarly, one could cite the impact on prices of highly emissive products, which could fall or even drop if consumer preferences change in favor of less emissive options. In the face of these risks, the following questions can be asked. Are the company's key assets likely to be stranded, lost value? One example is the case of known oil reserves, already valued in the balance sheets of major oil multinationals, which cannot be exploited in a carbon-neutral scenario by 2050. Has the company implemented remediation or workaround plans to continue its production process without this presumed stranded asset? These risks can also impact the company's investment plan. To mitigate its exposure to transition risks, the company can anticipate and adapt by gradually withdrawing from its emissive activities and replacing them with less emissive activities. Can the company invest in alternative production technologies? Does it have the financial strength or flexibility to anticipate these changes? Ultimately, these transition risks will have an impact on the value of the company. If it has assets that are likely to fail in the event of a transition, the perception of investors and lenders may be affected, making it more difficult to access the financial markets to finance new investments. It is therefore in the company's interest to anticipate these transitions. South Africa is an interesting case. Many parts of its economy are highly carbon-intensive, including railways, power stations, or ports built around fossil fuel-based industries. The AFD financed a study by the think tank Climate Policy Initiative in partnership with the World Bank to understand the impacts of a low-carbon transition on the South African economy, particularly on its businesses. South Africa's dependence on coal as a source of export revenue, fuel for domestic electricity generation, and a key source of employment in some regions poses a significant transition risk. This risk extends to other sectors such as transport, Transnet subsidizes its passenger transport business through its coal transport business. It is easy to understand the risks of moving away from coal: lower asset values and incomes, higher unemployment. However, a low-carbon transition can also present opportunities in the form of new markets: renewable energy, storage technologies, transition minerals, green hydrogen, e-mobility. Similarly, South Africa's exposure to the steel industry is another important transition risk, as the country is one of the largest producers of iron ore. Just like coal, South Africa could benefit from new markets for minerals used in low-carbon technologies, such as platinum for fuel cell vehicles and manganese for batteries. This study shows that while it is necessary to anticipate the impacts of transition risks on companies within a country, it is equally important to focus the analysis on the opportunities and new markets that this transition can create. In conclusion, physical and transitional climate risks can lead to substantial financial losses for the companies exposed to them, or to a depreciation in the value of their assets. These financial losses may in turn materialize in the form of a credit downgrade, leading to higher financing costs and even a liquidity crisis for the company. It is therefore essential that companies and investors take into account these risks, which are becoming increasingly fundamental in many sectors affected by climate change. The exercise is nevertheless challenging, as climate risks are by nature uncertain, correlated, sometimes indirect, and over a time horizon that is often incompatible with the short-term thinking of economic agents. Furthermore, although climate change and the low-carbon transition present significant risks, they also create important opportunities for companies. Developing a better understanding of the implications of these risks for their business model not only allows them to adapt to face these risks, but also to position themselves to access the markets of tomorrow. Ultimately, the analysis and publication of climate risk impacts on companies will improve transparency in risk valuation and promote a more optimal allocation of capital towards a more sustainable economy.